Imagine a world where human lives were treated as nothing more than tools for profit, a world where families were torn apart, and children were born not out of love, but as commodities. After the Atlantic slave trade officially ended, a horrifying practice known as slave breeding emerged, designed to maintain and expand the labor force for plantation owners. Men and women, stripped of freedom and agency, were forced to bear children, their lives dictated entirely by the greed of others. This dark chapter is not just a historical fact, it is a testament to the extremes of human cruelty, a reality that shaped generations and left scars that echo through time. In this video, we will journey through some of the lesser-known truths about slavery, stories often overlooked in textbooks and classrooms. From the cruel methods used to control enslaved people to the resilience and courage they displayed in the face of unimaginable suffering. These are narratives that demand to be remembered. Understanding these histories is not only a way to honor those who endured the unimaginable, but also a lens through which we can examine the enduring impacts of systemic oppression today. As we uncover these stories, it is essential to remember the humanity at the center of each fact. These were real people, with dreams, families, and emotions, whose lives were exploited for the economic gain of others. Their resilience and courage are lessons for us all, a call to reflect, learn, and act against injustice in whatever form it takes. If you are ready to dive into this powerful journey of remembrance and reflection, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode where we uncover history's hidden truths. Together, let us ensure these stories are never forgotten. After the grim realities of slave breeding, another form of control and exploitation emerged, one that invaded the most intimate aspects of human life: medical experimentation on enslaved people. In a world where enslaved men and women were treated as property, their bodies were often seen as instruments for advancing knowledge and profit, rather than as vessels of pain, emotion, and humanity. One of the most notorious figures in this dark chapter was Dr. Jerems, often referred to historically as the father of modern gynecology. His contributions to medicine have been celebrated in textbooks and statues. Yet the methods he employed reveal a disturbing narrative of exploitation and disregard for human dignity. Sims conducted surgical experiments on enslaved women, operating without anesthesia, under the assumption that their suffering was somehow less significant than that of white patients, a deeply ingrained belief that reflected the widespread dehumanization of black people at the time. Women like Lucy, Anarcha, and others were subjected to repeated, painful procedures, sometimes numbering more than a dozen operations per individual, without consent, and with no consideration for their suffering or the long-term consequences. These experiments were not isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic pattern in which the bodies of enslaved people became laboratories for medical advancement. Sims required only the consent of the enslaved women's owners, a cruel reminder that their autonomy was non-existent and their humanity was subordinated entirely to the pursuit of scientific discovery. Beyond the immediate physical pain, these procedures left enduring psychological scars, and the knowledge that one's body could be manipulated, dissected, or experimented upon at another person's whim created a climate of fear and oppression that extended far beyond the walls of the operating room. The tragedy of these experiments is compounded by the fact that, for decades, the historical narrative largely ignored the voices of the women who suffered, elevating Sims' professional accomplishments while silencing their pain and agency. Modern reassessments, however, have begun to shine a light on the stark reality behind the medical advancements once celebrated without question. These women's endurance and resilience, though exploited, are testaments to human strength and a reminder that even under extreme oppression, lives carry inherent dignity that cannot be erased by cruelty or ambition. By connecting this medical exploitation to earlier practices like slave breeding, it becomes clear that the institution of slavery was not only about forced labor, it extended into every aspect of life, seeking to control, manipulate, and commodify every possible facet of existence. The reproductive manipulation of enslaved families and the use of their bodies as instruments of medical experimentation were intertwined strategies of domination, both designed to assert power and maintain a system of economic and social control. In the shadows of this history, the courage of those who endured such suffering emerges as a quiet, enduring defiance. Their stories challenge the sanitized versions of history often told, compelling us to confront the complexity of human cruelty alongside extraordinary resilience, and to recognize that the pursuit of knowledge or profit at the expense of basic human rights leaves a legacy that echoes across generations, demanding reflection, remembrance, and justice. The horrors of slavery extended far beyond the manipulation of bodies through breeding or medical experimentation, reaching into the very landscapes where enslaved people lived, worked, and dreamed of freedom. And nowhere was this cruelty more terrifyingly tangible than in the use of trained hunting dogs for those who dared to flee the plantations. The promise of freedom was shadowed by the threat of relentless predators bred and trained to track, attack, and subdue human beings, transforming the simple act of running away into a life or death ordeal. These dogs were not ordinary animals. They were carefully selected for their strength, aggression, and tenacity, often a blend of powerful breeds whose sole purpose was to hunt down anyone attempting to escape bondage. The plantation grounds became arenas of fear, where every rustle in the woods, every snap of a twig, could signal the approach of both hunter and hound. Stories from the period describe the terror instilled in enslaved communities by these animals, which were as much a tool of psychological control as they were of physical enforcement. Families lived in constant anxiety, aware that any misstep or attempt at freedom could provoke a deadly chase, and that the dogs were conditioned to attack with precision and savagery. Captured escapees faced brutal consequences, often mauled or injured before being returned to their captors. And the mere presence of these beasts served as a grim reminder of the ever-present reach of the slaveholder's authority. The dogs became symbols of the inhumanity of the system, living embodiments of the power imbalance, and their very existence reinforced the sense that escape was not merely difficult, it was almost unimaginable. When examined alongside the enforced reproductive control and invasive medical experimentation imposed on enslaved individuals, the use of attack dogs illustrates a pattern of domination that sought to control not only labor and bodies but also the spirit and will to resist. The dogs were extensions of the owner's power. Their instincts honed to suppress rebellion and maintain order, and their terrifying presence worked to instill submission through fear, leaving psychological scars that mirrored the physical ones inflicted through other forms of oppression. Within this network of control, the courage of those who attempted to flee becomes even more remarkable. Risking not only punishment but also the threat of death, countless individuals sought freedom across forests, rivers, and swamps, their stories echoing the human desire for liberty in the face of unimaginable odds. In reflecting on this dark facet of history, it is impossible not to acknowledge the interplay between systemic cruelty and individual resilience. The hunting dogs, like the practices of medical exploitation and forced reproduction, were instruments of a system designed to commodify, dehumanize, and dominate. Yet, the very fact that so many enslaved individuals attempted escape, often guided by networks of allies and driven by hope, underscores the indomitable human spirit that persisted even under relentless oppression. These narratives, woven together, form a tapestry of both suffering and resistance, compelling us to confront the full scope of the horrors endured and to honor the courage that refused to be extinguished. even when pursued by trained predators and the unyielding machinery of slavery itself. Even as enslaved individuals endured the brutality of plantations, forced breeding, invasive medical experiments, and the ever-present threat of trained hunting dogs, the horrors of slavery extended far beyond the land, reaching across the vast oceans where human lives were reduced to mere cargo. One of the most infamous examples of this dehumanization occurred aboard the slave ship Zong in 1781, a tragedy that would later challenge the moral and legal boundaries of its time. During the voyage from West Africa to Jamaica, the ship's captain, citing fears of disease and a shortage of water, ordered the deliberate drowning of 132 enslaved Africans, treating them not as human beings but as lost property whose value could be reclaimed through insurance. Families were torn apart. Individuals suffocated beneath the weight of shackles and the oppressive hold of the ship's structure, and the ocean became a silent witness to an atrocity that words struggle to convey. The Zong massacre illustrates a chilling intersection of commerce, cruelty, and law, revealing the extent to which the institution of slavery commodified human life. When the ship returned to England, the owners sought compensation for their lost cargo, framing the deaths of 132 people in the language of insurance claims, rather than acknowledging the enormity of the human tragedy. Initially, the court sided with the owners, treating the enslaved as equivalent to livestock or goods, a stark reminder of how deeply entrenched the dehumanization of black people had become. Yet the story did not end there. Oloda Equiano, a formerly enslaved man living in England, learned of the massacre and brought it to the attention of abolitionists, igniting public outrage and a legal battle that questioned the very foundations of property, personhood, and justice. Through this case, the world began to confront the moral contradictions of slavery, as the voices of those who had been silenced at sea inspired challenges to the systemic cruelty of the trade. The massacre aboard the Zong is deeply intertwined with the other horrors previously discussed. From the forced breeding that tore families apart to the medical exploitation that disregarded human suffering, and the terror inflicted by hunting dogs on land. In each scenario, human beings were reduced to objects, their autonomy stripped, their suffering ignored, and their value measured solely in economic terms. Yet amid these acts of dehumanization, the courage of individuals who resisted, whether by documenting atrocities, seeking legal recourse, or aiding escape, emerges as a powerful counter-narrative. The efforts of Equiano and his contemporaries to expose the massacre highlighted not only the brutality of the system, but also the capacity for moral resistance and advocacy even within societies steeped in oppression. By linking the Zong massacre to the broader tapestry of slavery, one sees the continuity of exploitation across space and circumstance, from plantation fields to the decks of ships crossing the Atlantic. The legal and social response to this tragedy foreshadowed the growing abolitionist movement and underscored the tension between commerce and conscience, reminding future generations that slavery's horrors were not inevitable or natural but constructed and enforced by human hands. The story of the Zong stands as both a cautionary tale and a call to remember, a stark testament to the consequences of treating human life as property, a reminder of the courage required to confront injustice, and a lens through which we can understand the interconnected systems of oppression that shaped and continue to influence the world. Amid the sweeping horrors of slavery, from forced reproduction and invasive medical experiments to hunting dogs and maritime massacres, there exists a complex and often misunderstood facet of history: the phenomenon of freed black individuals who, in races, became slave owners themselves. At first glance, the story of men like Anthony Johnson, who gained freedom, acquired land, and even owned other enslaved people, seems to challenge the narrative that slavery was fundamentally rooted in racial oppression. Yet this perspective obscures more than it illuminates, and understanding the context reveals the deeper structures of power and systemic racism that defined the era. Johnson's experience. while extraordinary, was an anomaly, occurring within a social and legal system designed to marginalize black people at every turn. Even those who attained freedom faced a precarious existence, their rights fragile, their property insecure, and their social mobility limited by laws and customs that codified racial inequality. The seeming paradox of black slave ownership does not negate the overarching reality of slavery as an institution of racial domination. The story of John Punch, the first documented case of lifetime servitude in the American colonies, demonstrates the racial bias embedded in early laws. While his white counterparts attempting the same escape received only extended indentures, Punch was condemned to life as a slave. Over generations, the descendants of freed black property owners like Johnson often lost land, wealth, and sometimes freedom itself, victims of a society that increasingly restricted black autonomy. These exceptions, therefore, were not signs of a system that treated people of all races equally, but rather temporary divergences within a deeply oppressive framework. Linking this narrative to the other atrocities of slavery underscores a consistent pattern. The institution sought to strip human beings of autonomy, dignity, and rights, whether through coerced breeding, medical exploitation, brutal enforcement, or legal manipulation. Each of these practices reveals a society invested in maintaining control over black bodies and lives for economic gain. The stories of exceptional freed individuals owning slaves exist not to provide justification or minimize the suffering of millions, but to illustrate the complex interplay between freedom and oppression, the fragile and often illusory nature of autonomy within a system designed to subjugate. By situating this narrative within the broader arc of slavery, one sees that the exceptional cases of black slave owners do little to offset the systemic inequalities that defined the era. They serve instead as a reminder of how easily historical facts can be misinterpreted or weaponized to obscure larger truths. While these individuals exercised agency in a society that limited it, their actions cannot erase the overwhelming reality of a system built on exploitation, commodification, and racial hierarchy. Understanding their stories alongside the brutal realities of forced reproduction, medical experimentation, hunting dogs, and the horrors of the Zong massacre provides a fuller, more nuanced picture of slavery's reach. Ultimately, the narrative challenges us to confront complexity without losing sight of justice, to recognize anomalies while maintaining an awareness of systemic oppression, and to see that freedom, when constrained by pervasive inequity, is fragile and contested. The presence of a few black slave owners does not redefine the institution. Rather, it accentuates the multifaceted strategies of survival, adaptation, and resilience within an overwhelmingly hostile system. These stories, interwoven with the broader chronicles of cruelty and resistance, enrich our understanding of the era and remind us that history demands careful reflection, critical analysis, and an acknowledgement of the enduring legacies of power, oppression, and courage. As the web of oppression tightened around enslaved people, the cruelty of their captors often extended beyond labor, reproduction, and even the mind itself, reaching into the very flesh in ways designed to assert ownership and instill fear. Branding, a practice that treated human beings as if they were livestock, became one of the most overt symbols of dehumanization, leaving permanent marks that would haunt its victims both physically and psychologically. Across plantations, from the American South to colonies around the world, enslaved individuals were subjected to this brutal ritual, their skin seared with hot irons or marked with other devices to indicate possession, punishment, or value. For the enslaved, these brands were more than mere symbols of ownership. They were constant, inescapable reminders that their lives were considered property. their identities subjugated to the whims of another. The process of branding was not only excruciatingly painful but also psychologically devastating. Individuals lived with the memory of the heat, the smell of burning flesh, and the searing pain that accompanied each mark, carrying with them the trauma of a system that sought to erase their humanity. Families were particularly affected, as the act of branding could separate loved ones and obliterate the sense of personal identity that is foundational to human dignity. The scars were visible evidence of an enduring injustice. Yet even these permanent reminders could not capture the full extent of the emotional and psychological torment inflicted. Enslaved people often found themselves navigating a landscape of constant surveillance and threat, where the fear of punishment was ever present and every step could result in further violence or humiliation. When considered alongside other atrocities such as forced breeding, invasive medical experimentation, and the use of hunting dogs to track down escapees, branding emerges as a part of a broader system of control that extended from the body to the spirit. It was not an isolated practice but an extension of a pervasive logic that reduced human beings to commodities, whose labor, bodies, and autonomy were all subject to manipulation and exploitation. The permanence of the marks, both literal and symbolic, reinforced a hierarchy of power in which the enslaved were denied agency and treated as objects whose value was measured solely in economic or social terms. In this context, branding becomes a lens through which to understand the intersection of physical violence, psychological oppression, and the commodification of human life that defined slavery. Yet even amid such cruelty, acts of resistance and defiance persisted. Some enslaved individuals sought to conceal or alter their brands as subtle forms of rebellion, reclaiming a fragment of identity in a world determined to strip it away. Others endured, carrying their scars as silent testaments to resilience, reminders that even under extreme oppression, the human spirit persisted, linking the practice of branding to the broader tapestry of slavery from the horrific massacres at sea to the calculated medical exploitation on land highlights the systematic nature of dehumanization and the lengths to which a society would go to enforce subjugation. These marks, indelible as they were, also bear witness to the courage and endurance of those who survived, compelling us to confront a history of cruelty with honesty and empathy, and to remember that the scars of the past are inseparable from the stories of resilience and resistance that continue to shape our understanding of justice, dignity, and humanity. While the brutalities of slavery are often told through the lens of European colonists and American plantation owners, the history of the transatlantic slave trade is far more complex, involving intricate networks of power, negotiation, and complicity that spanned continents. African rulers and traders, motivated by a combination of economic opportunity, political strategy, and the pressures of ongoing conflict, played a significant role in this system, capturing and selling individuals from rival communities or prisoners of war to European merchants. This participation was not a reflection of morality or indifference, but of survival and the dynamics of power within African societies that were themselves diverse and often engaged in cycles of conquest and retaliation. Yet the consequences were devastating, as millions of men, women, and children were uprooted from their homes, stripped of their identities, and transported across the Atlantic under conditions so horrific that only the sheer human will to survive could carry them through. These transactions were complex, involving not only the transfer of human beings but also the flow of goods, weapons, and wealth, which in turn reinforced local hierarchies and fueled further conflicts. European demand for enslaved labor in the Americas transformed the trade into a relentless economic engine, where the value of human life was calculated in terms of profit, and African leaders often found themselves both participants and victims of the system they helped sustain. By exchanging captives for firearms and other European goods, some African rulers inadvertently strengthened militarized factions within their own regions, perpetuating cycles of violence and instability that would reverberate for generations. Families were torn apart long before they even boarded the slave ships, and communities were destabilized as neighbors, kin, and entire villages were removed from the social fabric of the continent. When linked to the other horrors of slavery discussed the forced breeding designed to sustain labor populations, medical experimentation without consent, the terror of hunting dogs, branding, and massacres at sea, the participation of African rulers adds a layer of tragic complexity. It reveals that the machinery of oppression was not the product of a single people or place, but a global network sustained by overlapping interests. Systemic inequality and the exploitation of human vulnerability. The moral responsibility is diffuse, yet the human cost is singular and absolute, etched into the lives of those who endured the Middle Passage, the forced labor of plantations, and the psychological scars of a world that treated them as property rather than people. Amid these horrors, stories of resistance, adaptation, and survival emerge. Individuals sought to escape, to protect family members, or to retain cultural and personal identity despite the overwhelming forces arrayed against them. Communities found ways to navigate the trade's demands, sometimes negotiating, sometimes resisting, always struggling to survive within the violent parameters imposed by both local and global powers. Understanding the role of African rulers and traders does not diminish the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade, but provides a fuller picture of the systemic nature of exploitation and the global networks that enabled it. It also underscores the enduring lesson that oppression is rarely confined to a single source. It is the result of intertwined structures of power, greed, and complicity, and that the legacies of these networks continue to shape societies and human relationships. Today, in remembering this, we honor both the complexity of history and the resilience of those who endured. Demanding reflection, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to justice and human dignity. Even in regions where freedom was supposed to prevail, the shadows of slavery reached deep into the lives of free black communities in the North, where the so-called reverse Underground Railroad operated with chilling efficiency. Unlike the more widely celebrated Underground Railroad, which offered a lifeline to those fleeing bondage in the South, this network preyed on individuals who had already attained freedom or were born free, kidnapping them from their homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods and transporting them back into the brutal world of enslavement. Families lived under constant threat, knowing that a single misstep, a deceptive promise, or a moment of vulnerability could result in abduction. The perpetrators, often white criminals, sometimes operating with the tacit or overt approval of local authorities, exploited legal loopholes, widespread racial prejudice, and a system that too frequently refused to recognize black autonomy, making escape or legal recourse nearly impossible for the victims. The stories of those caught in the reverse Underground Railroad are harrowing, as individuals who had known the liberties of free life were forcibly stripped of their rights, sold, and transported into labor systems from which there was little hope of return. Courts frequently disregarded evidence of freedom, dismissing documents proving an individual's status as a free person and refusing to allow black witnesses to testify against white kidnappers, effectively rendering legal protections meaningless. The psychological toll was immense. The terror of capture, the anxiety of separation from loved ones, and the cruel unpredictability of fate left deep scars on individuals and communities alike. For children, the fear was particularly acute, as even a brief absence or misidentification could lead to permanent enslavement, tearing families apart in ways that echo the separation inflicted on those born into slavery generations earlier. Linking this dark chapter to the broader context of slavery, the forced breeding of enslaved populations, medical experimentation without consent, hunting dogs, branding, and the Zong massacre reveals a recurring pattern of systemic violence and exploitation. Freedom, whether earned or inherited, offered no guarantee of safety, and the structures of oppression extended beyond the plantations into cities and towns where individuals might have believed themselves secure. The reverse Underground Railroad underscores the pervasive reach of slavery's logic. Control, commodification, and dehumanization were not confined to geography or circumstance, but were enforced wherever profit, prejudice, and fear converged. Yet even in this bleak landscape, resilience and defiance emerged. Communities developed networks of vigilance, support, and advocacy, attempting to warn one another and recover kidnapped members when possible. Abolitionists and sympathetic allies worked tirelessly to expose these crimes, challenging the systems that allowed free black individuals to be re-enslaved and advocating for legal reforms to protect human life and liberty. Their efforts, though often met with resistance, demonstrated the enduring courage and determination of those committed to justice and freedom. The story of the reverse Underground Railroad reminds us that slavery's impact was not limited to those born into chains, but extended into every facet of life for black people in America. Blurring the lines between freedom and captivity, it challenges simplified narratives of liberation, emphasizing that oppression is resilient and adaptive, and that human rights must be actively protected against both overt and covert forces of exploitation. By situating these kidnappings alongside the broader horrors of slavery, we see the full spectrum of systemic violence and the remarkable persistence of those who resisted it. These stories compel reflection, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to ensuring that freedom, once attained, is never again taken for granted, and that the lessons of history inform the pursuit of justice and dignity in the present day. As the institution of slavery became more deeply entrenched in the United States, the legal and economic structures surrounding it evolved with a ruthless efficiency that left little room for autonomy, dignity, or hope among the enslaved population. Slave codes, a collection of laws enacted across southern states, codified the complete subjugation of black people, defining them explicitly as property rather than human beings and regulating nearly every aspect of their lives. These codes dictated where enslaved individuals could go, whom they could associate with, what work they could perform, and even the education they could receive. With any transgression met by brutal punishment, families could be torn apart without warning, as the codes allowed owners to sell children, spouses, and parents at will, fracturing social bonds that had been carefully maintained in spite of oppression. The psychological weight of these restrictions was immense, as each law reinforced the message that enslaved people had no legal recourse, no claim to personhood, and no expectation of fairness, creating a climate of fear and submission that pervaded every moment of daily life. Compounding this system of legal control was the domestic slave trade, which became particularly pronounced after the U.S. Congress banned the importation of African slaves in 1808. In a cruel twist, the prohibition of external slave imports did not signal the end of the institution, but rather intensified internal trading networks, leading to the forced relocation of over 1.2 million enslaved people within the country. Families who had lived for generations in a single region were uprooted and sent to distant plantations, often in harsh environments such as the Louisiana sugar fields, where labor demands were relentless and mortality rates high. The journey itself, sometimes spanning weeks, was perilous, with overcrowded transport, inadequate food, and exposure to disease adding layers of suffering to an already devastating experience. These relocations were not isolated incidents but a systematic method of sustaining and expanding the economic value of enslaved populations, demonstrating how deeply entwined commerce and human exploitation had become. Linking the oppressive reach of slave codes and the domestic trade to the other atrocities of slavery, the forced breeding of individuals, medical experimentation without consent, terrorizing hunting dogs, branding, and massacres at sea reveals a consistent pattern of systemic dehumanization that transcended geography and circumstance. The very laws that were supposed to structure society instead facilitated the commodification of human life, ensuring that enslaved people remained under constant surveillance and control, their identities reduced to numbers, labor outputs, and economic assets. The domestic trade amplified this by turning families into movable property, displacing communities and eroding the cultural and emotional fabric that might have provided solace or resistance. Despite the enormity of these systems, enslaved people exhibited remarkable resilience, finding ways to maintain connections, preserve cultural practices, and resist exploitation whenever possible. Some engaged in subtle forms of defiance. Protecting children, sabotaging equipment, or preserving oral histories and traditions that would survive generations. Others relied on the broader network of abolitionists, conductors of the Underground Railroad, and sympathetic allies who risked their own safety to offer sanctuary and guidance. By situating the oppressive machinery of slave codes and the domestic trade alongside the broader context of slavery, the full scale of the institutionalized violence becomes clear, and the courage of those who endured it emerges in sharp relief. These stories demand reflection, empathy, and a commitment to justice, reminding us that systems designed to dehumanize can never fully extinguish the human spirit, and that the lessons of history must inform our understanding of rights, freedom, and the ongoing pursuit of equality. As we reflect on the long and harrowing history of slavery, from forced breeding and medical experimentation to the domestic slave trade and brutal systems of control, it is impossible to ignore that the fight against human exploitation is far from over. Today, slavery wears a different face, hidden in plain sight within global supply chains, workplaces, and even households. Human trafficking, forced labor, and coerced marriages continue to ensnare millions, with estimates suggesting that nearly 50 million people worldwide live under conditions where their freedom is stripped away, and their basic human rights are denied. Children, women, and vulnerable adults are especially at risk, often manipulated, threatened, or born into cycles of exploitation from which escape seems impossible. The modern manifestation of slavery may lack chains and plantations, but its cruelty and moral urgency remain as stark as ever. Understanding the historical roots of slavery gives context to the persistent inequalities we witness today. The systems of dehumanization, commodification, and exploitation that enslaved people endured centuries ago did not vanish, they transformed, adapting to new social, economic, and legal structures. Poverty, lack of education, political instability, and systemic discrimination create environments where modern slavery thrives, echoing the same mechanisms that allowed oppression to flourish in the past. Recognizing this continuity is crucial, because it reminds us that human rights are not automatically guaranteed. They require vigilance, advocacy, and action. By learning from the resilience and courage of those who resisted slavery in history, from the Haitian revolutionaries to the conductors of the Underground Railroad, we find guidance for combating modern exploitation and affirming the dignity of every person. The fight against modern slavery demands both individual and collective responsibility. Governments must enact and enforce robust laws. Companies must ensure ethical practices within their supply chains, and communities must remain aware, proactive, and ready to intervene when exploitation is suspected. Support networks, organizations, and reporting mechanisms exist globally, offering aid to victims and shining light on perpetrators, but they require public engagement to be fully effective. Awareness and education are powerful tools. By knowing the signs of trafficking, forced labor, or coerced marriage, We empower ourselves and others to act and prevent further abuse. As we conclude this journey through the painful and courageous history of slavery, it is vital to carry forward its lessons. Freedom is precious, human dignity is non-negotiable, and justice requires persistent effort. We honor the memories of those who suffered by ensuring their stories are never forgotten, by speaking out against oppression in all its forms, and by working to create a world where exploitation has no place. Every individual can play a part in this mission, whether through advocacy, volunteering, education, or simply by remaining informed and engaged. Thank you for taking the time to explore this important history with us. Your attention and reflection help keep these stories alive, and your actions can make a real difference in the fight against modern slavery. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so that we can continue raising awareness and sharing vital stories of human resilience and justice. Together, we can honor the past, confront the present, and work toward a future where freedom, dignity, and equality are realities for all.